Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with John Valaske, a native Kenoshan who has lived here all of his life. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
When were you born?
1935.
And what part of Kenosha did you live in?
On the south side, it was just south of 75th Street, because my dad and grandpa built the house, 1926. My dad was a graduate of Stout, and he came to Kenosha to teach, and he had the industrial arts, the carpenter skills, and grandpa had been a carpenter in Menominee, Wisconsin. That's where Stout was located, also my dad's hometown. And the two of them then did all the carpenter work and all of the work except, plumbing and heating and that sort of stuff on the house that they built on 6th Avenue, just south of 75th Street. That was in Pleasant Prairie until it was annexed to the city before they built.
Did you still live there? Do you still live in that house?
Yes, I do. Yes, there have been several articles about it in the Kenosha News about how I don't like change and how I kept as much of the original possible that I could, especially the refrigerator. Now the refrigerator.
What about the refrigerator?
Well, it's been running constantly since 1938. And I can always figure, how old the refrigerator is because it was purchased when I was 3, so I just deduct 3 years from my age. Then I can tell people how long the refrigerator has been going.
Okay, what are your earliest memories of Kenosha?
Well, of course, growing up there, why, at that time there were empty lots. The block was from 75th to 78th, and there were only a few houses around in the neighborhood, so there were a lot of empty lots. And as kids, we could play in those empty lots because they were overgrown with grass and weeds. And then once a year, the city would come around and they would cut the grass down.
Okay. Were there a lot of children in the neighborhood at the time?
Yes, quite a few. Considering that some of us were in school together, we were the same age, some a year plus or minus. So I would say that there were six or seven right in the immediate neighborhood that I grew up with, and a couple of them are still alive that I'm in touch with. Yes.
Amazing, wonderful. What kind of games did you play?
Oh, well, there was a war on. That was something that really caused a lot of, concern, or, people were drafted into the Army, Navy, that sort of thing, and they were away for the duration of the war. And of course, Pearl Harbor was in 41 when we would have been 6, and it went on until 45, which would have made us 10. So all during those war years, we were growing up, and we played Army. We had guns, we had foxholes, we would have war games, and in fact, my dad had built a tank out of old boxes, which was about 6 feet high. It had a turret on it, and we could play Army with a tank and had battles and that that sort of thing. So that was something that had, influenced us. And in spite of playing with guns, and
These weren't
ammunition,
real guns, though, however.
no, but they looked real.
They looked
and
real.
nobody worried about nobody worried about that. And in fact, as much shooting as I did that way, why I never fired a real gun.
Were there any other games that you played?
No,
No, that's pretty
not
much it.
that I can recall, because I was so caught up in the war effort that I had all kinds of clippings, pictures that I saved regularly from all of the magazines, the newspapers.
From
and-
that time period?
And had all of my bedroom wall plastered with pictures that I saved, plus clippings from the newspapers and all that sort of collection, yes.
Where did you go to school?
Well, I went to Durkee, which has since unfortunately been torn down. It's right on the corner of 62nd Street and Sheridan Road, right next to the Kenosha Hospital. And I would take the bus, the blue line, would run along 75th Street, go north on 5th Avenue, then cut over to 7th, and we would get off at the corner of 7th and 61st. Then we would cut through behind the Masonic Temple, where there was an empty lot. We would be over to Durkee School.
Okay, what was a typical day like in elementary school?
Oh, it was okay. We had the system at Durkee that was unique as far as the other elementary schools in Kenosha at that time were, that in most of the schools, the same teacher, say you had 4th grade, she would teach all of the subjects, your arithmetic, your English, your social studies, your science, all of those subjects would be taught by the same teacher. But at Durkee, we had the departmental system, which after the 2nd grade, starting in 3rd, we had different teachers for each subject. One would teach English, would teach the 3rd grade, 4th, 5th, and 6th. So she would teach all of those subjects. And
So
after
she would
we
teach
get-
that subject in all of the grades.
Yes, and there'd be a different teacher for social studies. That was Lila Shreve. She had been there for many years. And the classes then after 3rd grade were all on the 2nd floor, and we would pass around from one class to the other every hour. And that way they were able to specialize in their own subject, which for some reason, when that was adopted, each one was able to choose her own area of competency.
And as a student, what was the day like?
Well, I would ride the bus, in the morning and pick it up on the corner at 8:20.
Well, it was light by then, so.
Well, yeah, then of course during the war, yeah, we had daylight saving. It was wartime. During the war, in the dead of winter, why it didn't get light. Sunrise wasn't until about 8:30 in the morning, and so I can relate to all of those problems about daylight saving, having it the year round as we did during the war. And then because my dad taught at the high school, which was Bradford, downtown, he would come at noon and he would pick us up, and a bunch of kids would ride, with us because they wouldn't have to take the bus. So we had to go home for lunch. There wasn't any school lunch at those days. You were on your own, either walk or ride on the bus, or not too many even had bicycles then. So he'd pick us up, and then we'd have lunch at home, and then we'd go back at noon, and then at 4 o'clock, he was done at high school, even though we were done at 3:30. He would come by at 4 o'clock and pick us up. So that was another thing with gas rationing. Each one of the the cars that were available had 3 gallons a week, and I remember those ration books, and you would get the coupons, and you were allowed to buy 3 gallons of gas for, it was about 25 cents a gallon at that time, and we got by okay with that. Maybe they were about 15 miles per gallon, so that would give you about 45 gallons a week. Yeah.
So you would go to class and you would sit in a desk? You would sit in a desk in class? Did
Yeah,
you
sure.
ever move out of your desk? What kind of books did you?
Well, not really. Well, the desks had been there, you know, because we're talking about 1940s here. The school was built in the late 1800s, so they had the cast iron metal work around, then with the wooden top, and then the inkwell was that black ink, and we had the pens. You got the points you put in, and then you wrote.
You used the inkwell.
Yes, and ballpoint pens had just started to come in by the time we were in 6th grade. We had the Reynolds Rocket ballpoint. You could write underwater, was the way they advertised the Reynolds Rocket. But otherwise, we all wrote with the ballpoint pens, and we learned to write cursive. Everybody had to practice days and days, starting from 2nd grade on. Not only we learned how to print, but we learned cursive writing, practiced that, and we had these charts across the front of the room with each one of the letters of the alphabet and how to make them. And I can still, you know, do that. I know what a final T looks like when I write cat. I don't cross the T, but I make it with a final T. So now I understand some students don't even have to learn how to write cursive anymore, and they can't even tell if you write something why they can't, you know, decipher that. And I think that's a that's a real letdown. Yes. So.
What were your favorite classes in elementary school?
Oh, I don't know. I guess I liked pretty much all of them. I got good grades, and we had films. Well, this is kind of a funny sidelight, that one day a month we would walk from Durkee School over to the museum, which was the only museum, you know, in town, the Dinosaur Museum. And then Norbert Rader, who was the director of the museum, he would give us a little slideshow at the museum about a particular topic. And that was a highlight of our education because we didn't have films, as I recall, in junior high. We did later on, but we did not have the you know, 16 millimeter films. And we got books from the library. We would walk over to the Boys and Girls Library, which was on you know, 8th Avenue. It's been converted back into a church now, but we would walk over to the Boys and Girls Library once a week or something like that to check out books. So that was pretty much the advantage of that.
Okay, so did they have a junior high school system when you were going to school?
Yes. Yeah.
Where was that?
Junior high. Well, there were only 3 in town at that time, Lincoln, McKinley, and Washington. So all of us from Durkee went to Lincoln. Then at that time, we met up with kids who had been at Lincoln Junior High. So they became our friends at Lincoln for 7th, 8th, and 9th, and then also through high school. So I know a lot of those people that were high school classmates that went on to college, that sort of thing, and became some of them quite successful. Yes.
Okay, and then you went to Kenosha High School afterward, and your
Yeah.
dad was still teaching there?
No, he had been promoted when I was in 8th grade. He was promoted to become business manager for the public schools.
So how did you
So
get to
he
school?
left
Go ahead.
Bradford, and he went across the Civic Center to the school administration building, which was the place where the central office was, the superintendent, and the other officers were there. But that's another amusing story. The superintendent lived right next door. Forrest Connor became superintendent in 1944. Guy Loomis had been superintendent. He retired, and Dr. Connor came in 1944 and lived right next door. So there were several teachers, in the neighborhood that were involved in the system. Miss Donnelly and Miss Gray, they became principals. They practically lived across the street, and Har Smith taught printing at high school. So I knew a lot of the people. But after Dr. Connor was there, and I was leaving 6th grade, going to Lincoln, he changed the system. He changed it back to the way it was years ago, where each teacher would have to teach all of her subjects. They hadn't taught music, say, in years, and they had to go back and teach that again. They didn't like it. They went, some of them transferred to different schools and didn't stay at Durkee. And I never really understood why he wanted to do that, but apparently it was not conforming with the other elementary schools. Yes.
Okay. So you still got a ride to school when you went to high school? Or were you walking to school?
Well, because of my dad's change in time, because he did not have a teaching schedule anymore. When he became a business manager, well, he was still done at noon, but by that time I was at Lincoln, and then in another year I went to high school. So because he worked across from the high school civic center there, by then we were able to work that out, except at the end of the day, well, he had to work until 5, but I was done early. And then later on, I could drive a car myself and then be able to take the car and pick him up at
a family car.
At 5, yeah. Well, we only had
So
after the war.
If he worked a different schedule than you, why did you get the car and not him? Why were you driving the car if he needed it to go to work? Or did he walk to work so you could drive to school?
Well, I don't get your question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just meant that if you were driving at the latter years of high school,
Yes.
he would use the car to drive to his job. But you said you drove to school.
Well, no, he had, at the school administration building was right across kitty corner. So he would park there, and then I would walk over to school. But then I would be done at 3:30, and he would stay until 5. So I didn't want to hang around.
So you would drive the car home?
I would drive home, and I would come back to get him.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, yeah, it all depended on the system. See, we still went home for lunch, I guess. Have to make that clear.
Oh, okay.
That high school kids, we didn't hang around over the lunch hour. You had to get permission if you wanted to stay in school over lunch. Otherwise, you were expected to get out of the building, or sometimes if you had to stay for a special reason, you go over to Bill's Hamburger across the street. That was where Manja's later became, and that building was just torn down within the last few days. So Manja's, Bill's Hamburger, the dry cleaner, that's all gone across the street. Yeah, and it seemed like there was a big fuss. I remember in later years why the businessmen downtown didn't like the idea of all the high school kids going around causing trouble on their lunch hour, so they wanted to have a lunch hour for kids in high school, so they would have to stay in high school and not go around and cause trouble, because school didn't start until, well, 1:15, 1:30, and there's only 2 classes in the afternoon, so that gave us a nice long lunch hour. Yeah, so that was another funny. And some kids were still mad. Years after they got out of high school, they wouldn't go to certain stores because they remembered being mistreated when they were causing trouble in high school. Yes.
Did you develop any favorite classes in high school?
Oh, I don't know. I
don't know. English, social studies, math, science.
Oh, well, I always liked current events. Of course, going way back to when World War II broke out, I had all these clippings, all these files, and so on. So when I was a sophomore, that would be the first year, 10th grade in high school, why I took modern history, and it was really world history, and it had been misnamed, and Mabel Duncan was the teacher. And at that time, why, it was just starting of the Korean War. Started when I was a sophomore, first year in high school in 1950. And that became quite controversial with General MacArthur, who was the commander in the Korean War, and he got into trouble with Harry Truman, was president at that time, and MacArthur wanted to bomb the Chinese who were infiltrating over the Yalu River. That was a big deal, to bomb, to prevent the Chinese. And they had a big disagreement, and then Truman fired MacArthur. It was a big controversy. I remember all of that like yesterday. Truman fired MacArthur in April of 1950. And amusingly, MacArthur, after he gave this speech before Congress, his Old Soldiers Never Die famous speech before Congress, he came through Kenosha. It was in April of 1951 then. He came through Kenosha on Sheridan Road, and he came in the morning around 9:30.
So did you leave school?
Yeah, school did not start. We got special deal where, because we knew MacArthur was coming through, classes then were dismissed or not starting until after MacArthur came by. So we all did whatever we wanted to do. Most of them got positions where they could see him. And then after MacArthur was supposed to give a speech there, they had a little platform set up in the Civic Center right across from the post office. And I had a place staked out because I rode with my dad early at 8 o'clock. And then I got a space for getting a good view. And after MacArthur came in, why, because he was behind schedule, he did not go up on the platform. He had the microphone, somebody gave it to him, and he said something about the more I see of Wisconsin, the better I like it. And then they roared off. They gave him the presents, the gifts. They dumped him in the convertible, and he was away heading up toward Milwaukee. He had a connection with Wisconsin because a relative of his had been acting governor for a month or two way back years ago. So that was the connection why he was coming back to Wisconsin. So we went back to class, and then I asked, my teacher, who was Mabel Duncan. She was a good history teacher, been there for years, and she knew that I was favorable towards Republicans, and she said she did not go to the window. She did not look out over the Civic Center to see MacArthur when he came through Kenosha because she didn't like him. So I can remember all of that. It was really quite amusing. Yes.
What was the reaction of Kenoshans to MacArthur's parade?
Well, I guess it depended on the.
You were there. You observed. You heard.
Oh, sure. Well, it was, depending on how you felt about it. That he was on the wrong side, and Truman, of course, had that authority as commander-in-chief, and he was afraid that if we started to bomb north of the Yalu River, which was the dividing line between China and North Korea, that it would engage Chinese communists into war with the U.S. And they were very concerned about starting World War III. And you have to remember that there's only 5 years there, between 45 and 50, when we were just getting back into peacetime again. Now here it looked like we were going to get into a war with China, and Chiang Kai-shek had gone to Formosa. Now that's all in the news again. So it just seems like some of those things come back again to haunt us that we experienced back. It's 70 years now, and it's all recurs again. So it's just. So
did you hear more cheers, or did you hear
he
more?
He was only here for 60 seconds. and Marshall Simonson has pictures. They're nice. I got some of those pictures were given to me, 8x10 glossy pictures of Eisenhower in his convertible.
MacArthur, right?
MacArthur, yes, in his convertible. And Simonson got those. Some of them were taken from the roof of the post office, and that was about the extent of it. That he didn't get a chance to come up to the platform and talk.
Was there a large crowd along the street?
Oh yeah, pretty much, yeah. And the students, some of them didn't really care about it, and some of them were junkies like I was and wanted to get. So I still have all of those clippings. Yeah.
Okay, so over the decades, if you can go in 20-year spurts or 10 years, what have been the changes that you've seen in Kenosha as a community or a city?
Well, after the war, I have to back up that rationing then ended. Gas rationing ended quite soon, within a week or so after the war. And then they told us later on that it was really not as much of a problem with gasoline as it was with tires, because there was a shortage of rubber. The Japanese had taken over the rubber plantations in Southeast Asia, so we were just getting into synthetic rubber. So the rationing went by the boards. There was inflation. That was another big problem. Price controls had been in effect during the war. So you would see the sign in the store would say ceiling price, OPA, so many cents or dollars or whatever it was, so you knew that you weren't being overcharged. That went by the ward. Prices went up. Truman had trouble with the Republicans that took over. Well, the Republicans won in 48. They became
52.
senator, and the House became Republican. And then Truman had been reelected in 48, but then in 52 he was not running again, and Eisenhower then beat Adlai Stevenson in 52. So then the Republicans had taken over pretty much, and the war, then in Korea they had a truce that Eisenhower had negotiated in 53, and the truce is still in effect. There's never been a final peace treaty with South Korea and the U.S., so that's been, now they're firing rockets again, and that's another worry between North and South Korea. That was something that I can remember my whole life.
Okay,
Yeah.
so during World War II, there was gas rationing and there were price controls. How did the city change from 1945 to 1960?
Well, we had a city manager. I can respond to that the letterhead for the city of Kenosha always said mayor, it said manager, council, form of government across the top of the letterhead. 1922 was when we threw out the mayor, put in the city manager, and we had 7 members on the city council. They were elected at large for terms of 3 years. So we had 2, 2, and 3 elected each time, and that was considered a big thing. You'd get a city manager in there who traveled in various cities, worked his way up, sort of, so to speak, like the school superintendent would come in and move on a few years to another job. So we had a variety then of city managers. Then there was a big ruckus in 54 about reassessment. That had not happened in quite a few years, and after the 54 reassessment, they figured that the burden had been shifted onto the property owners from the factories and the businesses. So that was a big fight over that. So the manager was Richard Custer, and as I remember, he left to go to Zanesville, Ohio, and then they had a referendum on switching back to the mayor-alderman form of government. So that referendum passed, I believe, in 57. So in 58, then we were back, and Gene Hammond then, who had been on the city council, he was elected mayor, and that's the system that we have now.
Was there a lot of building going on? Was there a lot of people moving into the community?
Oh, sure. Big whole places where development. Frank Petretti developed a whole area on the north side. All kinds of houses were going up, all on the north side, Villa Capri area, and that was a big addition to Kenosha. Then in our own neighborhood, Southport, when I was a boy, Second Avenue and Third Avenue, the little loop that goes through there was all gravel. It was all sand. That was paved after the war, and Petretti built a lot of those houses. They were big houses that doctors and lawyers lived in. It was a very affluent area there at Southport. And that was really a big addition on the west side, all the way out towards Highway 31. That was addition. And population, well, when I was at Durkee School, I can remember it was 48,765 in 1940. That was the population. Then by 1950, it was up to 54,000. Now you see in the paper, Kenosha is the 4th largest city, and maybe it's going to be the 3rd largest after we get the new census. But it's not all just in the confines of the city limits. It's all the way out, and it's even jumped over Highway 41 now. That's a lot of it is different territory, so it's not all more people living in the same location. Yes.
So were there a lot of jobs which led people to come from other areas of the country here?
Well, I guess there were, except some of those, all of those jobs now have pretty much been eliminated because Nash, of course, during the war, Nash had expanded. Well, they made the airplane engines for Wright-Patterson, and you remember those concrete test cells along 30th Avenue was where they would test the engines. So that was a big deal. Then after the war, the Rambler with Romney, George Romney, why he became president of American Motors, and they built the Rambler. That was a whole thing. And Simmons had been on the lakefront. That left in 1960. They went to Munster, Indiana. Simmons employed at one time over 6,000 people right there making the Beauty Rest mattress. They made furniture that was for hospitals. They made a whole variety of things there. And then American Brass, of course, made shells during the war. That eventually closed down. So the factories, as we remember it, why gradually had gone by the wayside. So those people then who took jobs during the war then had to be repositioned into other jobs.
So there had been a big influx of people in the late 40s, and then by the middle 60s, a lot of those jobs had faded away.
Yeah, they, well, I don't know whether they were people that come up here. Well, quite a few of them had come up from the South to get jobs, and they, of course, then had good paying jobs. They were all, unionized. They had strikes. There was always labor strike, depending on which side, I guess, that you were on, that they would shut down. And then Simmons, they had a problem with piecework, where they would have to have so many jobs that could be completed in a certain time. So
timing studies to
yeah.
see how fast you could do something.
Yeah, so that was not really. And then I think after the war, with the interstate highway, this is another thing I noticed, that had friends who had parents, they would get a job in Milwaukee. Well, they wouldn't just drive up to Milwaukee, because you would have to go on Highway 41 and you'd have a lot of stops. So they would move to Milwaukee. Now if you get a job in Milwaukee, why, you just drive right up there and you don't think anything of it. Same way people working in Chicago, you could go down on the train, you could go on the Northwestern or on the North Shore, but then after the tollway came, why, you could drive quicker than you could take the train. So that changed a lot of systems. Then they claim that now Kenosha's developed more into a bedroom community where people don't work in Kenosha, they just live here, then they work out of town or out of state.
Okay, so as we move through the 60s and into the 70s, how is Kenosha changing? What's going on in the community? Expansion west, more school buildings, what kind of stuff was happening in the community?
Well, sure, the downtown was hit by stores that moved out.
What was it like early on, as you remember?
Well,
downtown?
we took the bus downtown. That was the main thing. Friday night stores were open. Otherwise, they all closed at 5:30. So then the shopping center, the Town and Country Shopping Center, that was a big deal out on 75th Street. Ace Hardware and the store, the grocery store that George Conley had, Conley Jewel, moved out there. So that was the big thing where the shopping center had taken people away from downtown. And Sears went to Pershing and closed downtown. They built the new Sears, which is since closed, in the new location where the Hawkeye Turkey Farm was. Then Regency was being built south of Racine. Then J.C. Penney left downtown and went up to Regency. So that was another blow against downtown. So that gradually diminished the stores that were downtown.
Did the attitude of Kenoshans change over these years that you remember from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s? Did the community attitudes shift or change?
Oh, I don't know. They all seem to, find enough stores to buy everything. It just seems that people have so much more stuff, as you say. And of course, because I still live in the same house, I've never really got into a lot of that. But you read all these stories about how 70% of the economy now is from the consumer's point of view, all the stuff that you buy. Then because of the pandemic, when you couldn't get out, why, you had to buy over mail. Then you had all this stuff sent by mail, and if you didn't like it, you could return it. Now there's stories in the paper how they want to cut back on the return policies so they don't have to refund as much money. But the size of the stores now are just huge, that I can't get over just how many choices they have. Because when I lived on 6th Avenue, 7th Avenue had a grocery store and a pharmacy right on the corner, and you could walk up there and you could take care of everything that you would need, and they would deliver whatever you needed right in the neighborhood.
Okay, so how do you think, or looking back, do you think you could have imagined what Kenosha would be today?
Oh, I don't know. I think that we were surprised that it would fill up so much of the area between Chicago and Milwaukee. I think that because the distance was greater, at that time, but we were, well, when television came in, the Chicago stations were the first ones we got, and Milwaukee was later in their stations, and everything was just the channels 2 until 12, 13, something like that. So that limited the number of stations, but Kenosha, I think, was pretty much oriented toward Chicago.
Even back then?
Yeah, we got the Tribune every day, got the Tribune delivered, and had, the Hannock News Agency was the distributor of the Tribune. We got the Chicago News, and had the tower on the house that I still have.
Your antenna.
Tower, well, it's not on the house, it's freestanding to get it off the roof. And you could get Chicago on that side, and then on the back of the antenna, you could get the Milwaukee stations. And that still works out, even though I had to get a converter box when they changed from analog to digital, but I survived that change, yeah. But I guess sometimes you read that when they have what they call the standard metropolitan statistical figures, that Kenosha is listed in the Chicago rather than in the Milwaukee metropolitan area. So that's something that I can relate to the Chicago side, even though I was not, really a traveler that much down to Chicago.
Do you have an idea of what you think Kenosha will be like in the future? What kind of a community do you think it will become?
Well, don't really know. I think that I always thought Kenosha and Racine, would grow together. That it's pretty much contiguous now in a lot of areas, and that was one of the ideas when Parkside started having it halfway. Well, really not quite halfway between Kenosha and Racine, that the two would go together, but that didn't really happen. There's still the rivalry between the two of them, and some of those things that they thought would happen, why didn't really happen. There's still that rivalry, and as I talked about it in one of the earlier interviews that I gave about the location of where they were going to put Parkside, was quite controversial, whether it would be in Kenosha or Racine, and what you were going to call the campus was not named after either one, but that's how Chancellor Wiley named it as Parkside. But I think that the idea that they would grow together, well, I don't know that that's going to happen.
How about politically? Do you think there's been a change in Kenosha as a whole, politically, from what it maybe had been in the 40s, 50s, 60s?
Well, yeah, it seems to be more Republican, yeah, that I'd always heard that Illinoisans who were moving up here did not have the labor union Democratic background, and then some of those had Republican views, which would come to dominate, but you can still see on the maps that Kenosha, Racine counties still had been closer, but now it's more 50-50, and that seems to be something that we'll see, in the election next week, I guess. Yeah.
All right, thank you for talking today with me. Thank you so much.
Well, I hope you're all up to date. I'll come back in another 20 years. Okay.